Edward Ducan, a contemporary at St. John's and later a Tory cabinet minister, remembers thinking that Amos had political steel in him. It seems hard to reconcile Amos's attachment to the dour dogmas of the party line with the life and soul of the party reputation by which he was best known and best remembered, and it was often hard for his friends to reconcile the two Amoses at the time. They sometimes laughed delightedly at his mimicry and abused him violently for his opinions in the same evening. Communism was an aberration in Amos's life not to be repeated in any other dedicated political attachment, as it was in Terrain's and Murdoch's. She describes her 2 or 3 years in the party as first enthusiastic, then very unhappy. Standard youthful rebellion against his father was one reason for Amos's communism, but there were other reasons too. Reflecting on this episode in a radio talk 20 years later, Amos discovered a likeness between himself and Jimmy Porter, hero of John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, 1956, in their common youthful desire to feel enthusiastic about something, about anything. As the Spanish Civil War and the Hitler menace had developed, Amos said, "I got to the right age at the right time to feel the pull of the good, brave cause, the attractions of warning England of dangers insufficiently visible to the majority, the established, the reactionary, the complacent, the old." But the fact that his causes were righteous enough was no more than a fortunate coincidence, the worthiness of a cause not being established simply by its ability to attract young, generous, compassionate, reasonably intelligent minds. Other, less creditable motives, fears, and aggressions were also at work. He remembered how necessary it can feel to be one of an embattled minority. If he thought your deep-seated need is always to be swimming against the stream, you can usually find a stream that will do at a pinch. In 1941, Amos did feel the need for such a stream. 20 years later, he had got over it, and felt able to recommend an antidote for those who might still not have recovered. Beginning with a wholly Amosian course of drink and amour, and proceeding to a more prosaic program of resistance to the pressures of temperament and emotional need that constantly threaten to distort one's picture of reality. But communism had its compensations. The orthodoxy of the left included permissiveness about sex, and left-wing girls were apt to be earnest in their duties, including their duty to sexual freedom. This female earnestness could, however, have its dampening effects, one communist girl being reputed to interrupt her embraces with a stern reminder to her partner, "Remember, the party comes first." It was through the Labour Club that Amos contrived to do what he had been wanting to do for several years: lose his virginity. One female member of the club tipped Amos off that another girl would be willing to go to bed with him if he asked her. So he did. She agreed, but gave him an improving book to read first. The manual with a title along the lines of Happy Marriage, and an author with a Dutch-sounding name, both now forgotten. By way of further preparation, Amos needed to buy a packet of condoms, or French letters, as they were always known in the 1940s. Feeling shy about this, he dropped in again on his friend George Blunden, and asked if he would go with him to the chemist. Blunden agreed, and the necessary French letters were purchased. Later he became Sir George, and a deputy governor of the Bank of England, helping Amos lose his virginity being his one enormous contribution to English letters. Something remarkably similar happens to Robin Davies in You Can't Do Both. From being a schoolboy in South London, he moves on to being a wartime Oxford undergraduate like Amos. Robin talks to 2 girls at a meeting of the Classical Society, Patsy Cartland and Barbara Bates. Patsy tips him off that any advances he might make to Barbara would be well received. This turns out to be true when he makes a trial run of limited advances. Robin and Barbara arrange another encounter at which it is understood they will go the whole way. Barbara gives him a book to read first, a sex guide, Van der Decken's Happier Love. There is no such book, by the way. Amos borrowed the name Van der Decken from the Flying Dutchman. They meet to have sex on 2 occasions in Robin's rooms. Neither encounter is a success. After the second, Barbara disappears for good, leaving Robin feeling ashamed and humiliated. Where Robin goes wrong is in ignoring the advice of Van der Decken. Admittedly, he is not a very easy guide, recommending foreplay, but warning that too much of that amounts to perversion, so leaving the reader to guess how much is too much. But Van der Decken's broader point is that men should understand women's different needs, and Robin fails to do so. His first attempt with Barbara is perhaps no worse than gauche, but at his second he simply plunges ahead without any thought for her at all. He is rather proud of himself for having abandoned Vanderdecken in favour of the do-as-you-please style recommended by such writers as Blake and D.H. Lawrence, and an American psychologist called Homer Lane. But in pleasing himself, Robin has committed a near rape on Barbara. No wonder she runs away. The influence of Homer Lane had reached Oxford by way of a psychologist called John Layard, who gave a series of lectures at the university, which Philip Larkin attended. Lane followed the progressive, which is to say anti-repressive, line in the treatment of juvenile delinquents and in psychoanalysis. He subscribed to the Laurentian notion that God stood for physical desire. He thought, for example, that boys develop wisdom and character by free choice and self-expression, and that juvenile delinquency was a matter of positive virtues wrongly expressed. Lane had scored a certain success in Britain during and after the First World War, attracting support for his projects of reform from such eminences as the Earl of Sandwich and Lord Lytton, Viceroy of India, who once summarized an idea of Lane's in the words, "No attempt must be made to inculcate moral standards. They must be allowed to grow." Lane was eventually compelled to leave the country after allegations that he had taken advantage of girls in his care. Through John Layard, Lane's message had reached Christopher Isherwood and W.H. Auden in Berlin, and through them it reached Robin Davies in Oxford, and Amis too. Amis did not in fact think equally highly of all these writers, especially Lawrence. Here he disagreed with Philip Larkin, who in a letter to a friend described Lawrence as a sort of touchstone against the false, the exact opposite of Amis's view. Amis did, though, think highly of Auden and Isherwood. But literary judgments and precise sources of influence are less important than the fact that a climate of permissiveness reinforced by a certain amount of intellectual high-mindedness was congenial to young men like Robin and Amis as providing justification for the sex they already had on their highly charged minds. The responsible Vanderdecken is the sort of writer who believes that love-making is unlikely to be successful or even pleasurable unless each party is able to contemplate with serenity the state of marriage with the other, which is exactly what Robin does not want to believe. Homer Lane, on the other hand, told you it was all right to do what you wanted to do, which was a slogan not without its problems, but had the merits not only of being what Robin did want to hear, but of being precisely the opposite of how his father thought about everything. Robin's first sex with a girl from the classical society starts him off on a series of adventures with women in which his own selfish appetites are all the time at odds with his responsibilities, much as Vanderdecken's values are pitched against Lane's. Amis's first excursion with the girl from the Labour Club started him off in the same erratic direction. Girls, however, did not play as large a part in Amis's first 4 Oxford terms as male friends, especially Philip Larkin. After they were first introduced by Norman Iles, Amis found Larkin instantly affable, to be seen as one who erected no barriers. He thought Larkin's name a trifle comic, and his clothes, tweed jacket, wine-coloured trousers, checked shirt, bow tie, flashy. The 18-year-old Larkin's hair was already thinning, and he was afflicted with a stammer. Both hair and stammer were to disappear progressively over the years. He turned out to like films, cricket, science fiction, programs on the wireless, and other things congenial to Amis's taste, such as smoking, drinking, and behaving badly. Romantic expectation of such a pairing as Amis and Larkin, 2 budding literary talents encountering each other in the flush of youth among the lawns and spires of Oxford, would have them discoursing on high art and other lofty matters as they lolled in the sun by the river or in their rooms late into the night. But alas for romantic expectation. That was not the nature of their relationship. For one thing, at Oxford they met mostly in the company of others. It was not until after Larkin had left the university that their relationship became more directly personal. It is possible that Larkin would have liked more serious literary exchanges with Amis than they had. He enjoyed exchanges of this kind with others, particularly his art student friend Jim Sutton. But this was not Amis's way, at Oxford or ever, and Larkin learned to steer clear of it in his company. Literary matters, as a subject of social intercourse, always made Amis uneasy, unless in the form of anecdotes, jokes, gossip. Such talk was apt to be pretentious, fraught with potential for boredom, and risked distracting writers from their real business of writing, even filling them with doubts about their ability to do so, which was what Amis came to think went wrong with Larkin. On serious matters, too, Amis and Larkin were liable to have serious differences, as over Lawrence. Such dabblings in the unconscious as interest in Lawrence and Layard involved were very much to Larkin's taste, but very much not to Amos's. So when they were together, they put these matters to one side and got on with what they could agree about, which was mainly the things they both found funny or derisible. Amos's lifelong objection to straying much further into literary country in conversation than quoting an obscene limerick, discussing a grammatical crux, or arguing the definition of a word, often gave the impression that he had few real literary interests, that he was even a bit of a Philistine. If somebody happened to mention a writer admiringly, his way of dismissing that writer in peremptory style as no good, or worse, no good at all, reinforced that impression. But the impression was misleading. Amos always had strong opinions, but he knew what he was talking about, even if he didn't talk much about what he knew. You might catch a glimpse of just how much he knew by challenging him with a quotation or a rare word, in which case you were likely to be overwhelmed by the comprehensiveness of his answer. But then the curtain fell, and the conversation moved on. Nor did Amos dislike every form of serious literary intercourse. He enjoyed it enormously, provided it was conducted in the right context, which for him came to mean teaching students. With them, he felt you could say, "Jolly interesting that thing Milton said in Paradise Lost. Book 6, isn't it? Let's look it up." But you could not say that in the pub or the club or over the lunch table. At least Amos could not. It was one thing for him to take himself seriously, very seriously, as a writer, but it was quite wrong to inflict this seriousness on other people by behaving like a writer in public. What he and Larkin actually did together was drink, gossip, tell jokes, swear, and in general behave like a couple of college hearties, without, of course, the hearties' appearance on the sports field. There was no secret between them that they wrote poems, but so did plenty of others. Writing poetry was not what they often discussed, and insofar as they did discuss literature, it tended to be in disparaging terms, particularly with the writers they were both required to read for the English course, almost none of whom was excluded from their common dislike. Amos found that Larkin had written at the bottom of the college copy of Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, "First I thought Troilus and Cresside was the most boring poem in English, then I thought Beowulf was, then I thought Paradise Lost was. Now I know that the Faerie Queene is the dullest thing out, blast it." In describing some piece of Old English as ape's bum fodder, Larkin probably said no more than most of his fellow students of that language thought. But his dislikes went further, applying almost equally to Middle English, for writers in which other undergraduates could find at least something good to say. Chaucer, for example. But not even the Romantics escaped Larkin's criticism. Amos cannot remember his having a good word to say for any writer on the syllabus, with the possible exception of Shakespeare. Much of this jeering was a pose for both of them, as much to do with dislike of having to read writers to pass exams, as dislike of the writers themselves. It became something of a point of honor never to say anything good about any writer who had to be studied. For unlike the glamorous butterflies who flitted through the pages of Oxford novels and never seemed to be troubled by such trivialities as exams, passing exams was ultimately what Oxford was all about, for humbler folk like Amos and Larkin. Having been liberated from school to become men, they found themselves back on the old exam-passing treadmill after all. They resented the grind, and took it out on the grist that fed the mill. Most people reading English, Amos wrote in his memoirs, treated literature as a pure commodity, a matter for evasion and fraud, confidence trickery to filch a degree. You read what you had to, and went to lectures about it to prepare for the only significant event, the coming battle of wits with the examiners. The effect was paradoxical. Writers on the syllabus were resented for that reason, for being part of the whole tedious apparatus of exam passing and required learning. Even if you liked what you read, it was hard to put in a good word for the authors among friends similarly afflicted by the same set texts. Ploughing your way through, say, the Faerie Queene just because it was its turn to be read did not seem the ideal way of getting to grips with what was said to be a classic. On the other hand, would you read it at all unless you were compelled by the curriculum to do so? Very likely not. There seems no alternative to compulsion, even if compulsion creates resentment. For Amos, at least, resentment was in time to be replaced by gratitude. He was glad he had read the Faerie Queene, even if only once and under duress, for he would have been the poorer if he had never read it at all. And there was perhaps a hidden benefit in the aggressive attitude Amis and Larkin took towards the syllabus. If they treated virtually every single set text with suspicion, not to mention the commentators on those texts they had to read too, then they had to have their own agenda. They could hardly claim to be interested in literature if they wrote off the entire English canon as no good at all. That might be how mere traders in exam results felt, even if they hardly dared say so out loud, but it was not enough for people aspiring to be real writers themselves. They had to make up their own minds what was good and what bad. In later life, Amis always knew clearly what he liked and disliked, and when he was a university teacher he always tried to make his students judge set books for themselves and not simply recycle other critical opinions. It seems likely that the process of sorting out his ideas and priorities began when he found himself rubbing up against the challenging orthodoxies of Oxford. Meanwhile, other writers could be all right, even talked about, provided they were not on any reading list. Larkin introduced Amis to, or quickened his interest in, such modern writers as Auden, Isherwood, Betjeman, Anthony Powell, Motelan, and Henry Green, but they had the immense advantage of being alive, and therefore in no danger of appearing on the syllabus, at any rate the compulsory part, which contained no writer who flourished much beyond 1830. Amis arranged for 2 of Larkin's poems to be published in the Labour Club Bulletin when he was its editor, and was denounced for bourgeois obscurantism by the club committee. After his war service he also read the early pages of Larkin's novel Jill, 1946, and even offered suggestions. Otherwise, the only literary cooperation between the two at Oxford was in writing pastiche. One of their joint efforts was The Bursar's Tale, done in Chaucerian style. Another was a set of obscene fairy tales in an archaic 16th century sort of English. One Amis wrote was called The Jolly Prince and the Distempered Ghost, which included a farting contest between the prince and the invisible ghost. They also wrote a soft-porn lesbian story, taking turns to write a chapter, then sending it to the other to continue. The story featured 2 girls sharing digs. The girls were dreamy, they batted their eyelids, their hair fell into their eyes. In their room they had a cupboard full of jazz records which Amis and Larkin had read about, but which had not been issued in Britain. One record they both had was called I Would Do Anything for You, and that became the title of the book. Other records supplied chapter titles. It was in jazz, more than in literature, that Larkin seriously influenced Amis in his first Oxford terms, and it was to jazz that they both applied the zest for enthusing and discriminating that might have gone into literature, had that not been ruled off limits by virtue of its status as exam fodder. Jazz was a new enthusiasm for Oxford undergraduates. Those with a taste for it tended, like Amis and Larkin, to have picked it up indirectly at first, through hearing dance band music on the wireless, into which occasional hot numbers would be infiltrated, a piece called Tiger Rag being a leading early example. Jazz had the twin advantages of being disapproved of by parents and not being taught at school or Oxford. To Amis, liking jazz seemed a completely natural thing, which he learned could be not only entertaining and enlivening, but emotionally moving too, if not quite as much as parts of some classical works. But to Larkin it appeared altogether more thrilling. Jazz possessed, he wrote, that unique, private excitement that youth seems to demand, which in another age might have been supplied by drink or drugs, religion or poetry. Larkin's expertise and passion had advanced further than Amis's. His parents had bought him an elementary drum kit, on which he battered away contentedly, and he could play jazz piano with, Amis recalls, some proficiency in an unemphatic style. Sometimes at sessions in the Victoria Arms in Walton Street, Amis would sing, or rather bawl, accompanying lyrics, providing no strangers were present. Larkin brought with him to Oxford a small record collection he had built up with his friend Jim Sutton, who was a student of the Slade, then evacuated from London to the Ashmolean in Oxford. The Oxford University Rhythm Club, set up in 1941, held sessions in rooms above the George Hotel, to which they invited players from London. George Shearing came twice. Oxford also produced a band of its own, the University Bandits. This had started out as a band for college dances and perhaps a useful source of income for its members, but it could often not raise enough of these to fulfill its original purpose. At one time it had only 2 saxophonists and a rhythm section, so was obliged to resort to jazz improvisations. One of the saxophonists was Mervyn Brown, later Sir Mervyn and High Commissioner to Nigeria, the only one who could read music among the circle of St. John's jazz enthusiasts, which included most of the Seven, and others like Edward Ducan and Graham Parks. Amos and his friends built up their collections as best they could, though this was not easy in wartime. Sometimes records out of print, known as deletions, could be found at two shops, which later merged into one, Acott's and Russell's, and undergraduate enthusiasts were not above stealing them if they got the chance, though recollections about this are hazy, if not contradictory. Nick Russell recalls Larkin wearing a bulky brown check overcoat with a poacher's pocket big enough to conceal a 10-inch record, but insists that, though Larkin might pretend he was about to raid a shop, we were far too respectable, middle-class, and nervous actually to shoplift. In Amos's version, the coat with the poacher's pocket was a sport jacket belonging to Edward Ducan, which was borrowed by his friends for exactly this purpose. Amos himself once walking out of a shop with a much-envied Sidney Bechet disc stowed away. Whichever version is the truth, and perhaps both are, mere contemplation of law-breaking is some indication of the excitement jazz aroused in those who had caught the bug. Having found jazz, Larkin wrote, we made it bear all the enthusiasm usually directed at the more established arts, and it was towards 100 or so jazz records that he and his friends devoted their early anatomizing passion, which more conventionally would have gone into books or perhaps classical music. Pee Wee Russell, clarinet and saxophone player, was our Swinburne and our Byron, Larkin wrote, and he sat around with the others enthusing over and analyzing their favorites in a way they never did with writers. But then, jazz music was not on the syllabus. It was a private joy, unofficial and unsanctioned, even treated with gratifying contempt by older generations. Later all that changed. The long-playing record replaced the shellac 78, so ending the concentration and concision enforced by the 3 and a bit minutes of music, which was about as long a bout of dancing as people could manage at the energetic pace it set, and was also as much as one side of a 78 could carry. Concerts, critics, journals, university courses, all appeared in their turn to make jazz respectable to a larger audience, and so diminish the subversive charm it held for its pioneer devotees. Far worse, from Amos's point of view, was the emergence of a new kind of jazz called bebop, a movement led by players like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, which might have been more fun for them to play, but certainly was not more fun for others to listen to, at any rate not for Amos. Although he could not know it at the time, in the very year 1941, when Amos was developing to a high pitch his passion for jazz, Parker and the others were conspiring to destroy the music that enthused him. Amos, however, did not give up on it. For the rest of his life he remained faithful to the jazz heroes and heroines he had learned to adore at Oxford. The White Chickagones, Count Basie's band, Bix Beiderbecke, Sidney Bechet, Henry Allen, Muggsy Spanier, Fats Waller, Early Armstrong and Early Ellington, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, Rosetta Howard, and Cleo Brown. Still today he plays half a dozen tracks from among these favorites on his tape recorder every day. He might even play a tape or two of Artie Shaw or Benny Goodman, performers who in Oxford days were likely to be sniffily dismissed as too commercial, but now seem touched with the magic of a long-lost golden age. 5. In the Army. After 4 Oxford terms, the Second World War was still going inconveniently strong. Amos had no choice now but to join the army. Soon after he did so, a fellow recruit asked Amos his first name. Kingsley, Amos replied. Finding that a bit of a mouthful, the man asked if he had any others. William, said Amos. And William, shortened to Bill, is what he became for the rest of his military service, and the only period of his life. So, aptly enough, losing his familiar name along with his civilian identity for the duration. Becoming a soldier meant for Amos venturing beyond the restricted circles of home, school, and university, to live, for the first time, among people from every social background and every part of Britain. This might be called entering the real world. As Amos quickly discovered, however, the army was an unreal world too, following its own arbitrary and bizarre rules, particularly in matters of order and discipline. He never did encounter such fabled absurdities as lumps of coal, kept specially polished, to provide for the eye of the barrack-room inspector a smooth surface to a burnished coal bucket, but he was perfectly willing to believe such things could happen somewhere. The army's inscrutable workings had that effect on Amos as on others, of making the mythical or absurd seem entirely possible, and coming as no great surprise when they sometimes happened. He came to see the military life as resembling some strange society out of science fiction, a world much like our own in general appearance, but with some of the rules changed or removed. In July 1942, Amos turned up wearing civilian clothes at Catterick Camp in Yorkshire, was handed out denim fatigues, and a few days later a proper private's battle dress uniform. He was soon immersed in that mixture of bull, boredom, and hectic activity which distinguished every recruit's basic training. Amos thought he looked a goon and a bleeding civvy in uniform, but he retained at least one skill he had acquired in the school and university corps. He was good at drill, an improbable accomplishment perhaps, but one of which he was proud. Not only was he good at being drilled, at following orders to quick march, turn right, halt, stand at ease, stand easy, he was good at drilling others too. He thought of this as a matter of timing and confidence, a kind of acting and showing off, rather than as evidence of physical prowess. He claims once to have amazed a drill sergeant by a virtuoso performance in which he put a squad through its paces in a shed no bigger than a Nissen hut, bringing his display to a brilliant climax with an immaculately timed right turn when the men were just half a pace short of crashing into the wall. Because of his corps experience, Amos's basic training was cut to 2 months, too brief a period in the ranks he believed to give him as full an understanding of how the army worked as he might have got if he had spent more time with ordinary soldiers. When basic training was over, he was posted to the Royal Signals Unit for officer cadets, 152 OCTU, also at Catterick, where 26 weeks further training brought him a commission as a second lieutenant. A series of assignments followed, to Southern Command Signals at West Farnham near Salisbury, to High Wycombe, then back to Catterick for an advanced wireless course, and on to Headington Hall in Oxford, later the home of the disgraced tycoon Robert Maxwell. At Headington in November 1943 he joined 2nd Army HQ Signals, a unit at full strength numbering some 50 officers and 1,000 men, with which he was to spend the rest of the war. A series of experiences across the south of England followed, when Amos's unit, like dozens and hundreds of others, prepared for the invasion of Europe. The exercises, with codenames like Eagle, Mara, and Blank, mainly involved setting up and dismantling communications networks. For one, codenamed Gold Braid, each soldier was issued with what were bluntly described as 2 bags vomit, meaning in army speak, not 2 bags of sick, but 2 bags to be sick into. Another exercise, called Spartan, involved sending men out with no rations, though whether this was intended to teach them how to cope with hunger or how to live off the land is not clear. At any rate, Amos was lucky enough to miss it. All this training and exercising was to expand Amos's sense of the absurdity of army life. For many of the things he was taught he never actually had to do, learning to fight as infantry, for example. What this meant he described 20 years later in a short story, I Spy Strangers, and repeated in his memoirs. There were the cross-country runs, the musketry competitions, the 3-day infantry tactics schemes with smoke bombs and real barrage, the 12-mile route marches in respirators. Such infantrymen's exercises may have been a wise precaution in case the Allied armies were routed and had to fight to the last signalman, though they were just as likely motivated by the inferiority feelings common to all technical troops, because of the safety of their jobs compared with those of tank or infantry soldiers. But whatever the reason for it, the training was wasted. Amos's unit travelled across Europe in vehicles, and did not go near the front line, so he finished the war without having to walk a step or fire a shot. His advanced wireless course turned out to be equally wasted. It involved him in experiments with early versions of telex transmitters and qualified him to operate a radio link as far as Moscow. Under the supervision of the prophetically named Major Dixon, he finished up with a Q2 rating, the military equivalent of a third-class university degree. But once he had completed the course, the army kept him away from all wireless equipment. If all this superfluous training was part of some larger plan into which the likes of Amos were magically slotted without their knowledge, then the mystery was never revealed. More probably they were the consequence of having to rough-hew in short order a vast military machine for an unpredictable invasion from such fit young men as were available. But however inspired, the dead-end training added to the sense of unreality that had begun to form in the barrack room and on the parade ground. Still, there were compensations to be had in all this wasted energy. The circumstances of war, which had plucked Amos out of Oxford, had detached many others from their normal lives too, making this no bad time to be a sexually eager young man on the lookout for unexpectedly available women. At Catterick, Amos took out an ATS soldier called May, but did not let things go too far, regarding her civilian clothes, and especially her licorice all-sorts hat, as a statement of over-enthusiasm he very much didn't want to encourage. In a caravan in High Wycombe, he had a fling with a South African girl whom he borrowed, as it were, from Thomas Ballow, the Hungarian refugee and economist, later an advisor to Harold Wilson. More seriously, he began a 2-year affair with a married woman, Elizabeth Simpson, of which he gave a version in his first serious adult try at fiction, Who Else Is Rank? This was intended to be a novel of more than 80,000 words, written jointly with a brother officer, E. Frank Coles. They took it in turns to write sections, working after dinner in Belgium over a period of months in 1944-5. Amos appears as something like himself under the name of Francis Archer, and Coles appears as Stephen Lewis. The novel was never completed or published, but several sections survive, mostly tales and sketches of army life. 2 sections called Rhapsody and Ecstasy give a version of Amos's affair with Elizabeth. In Rhapsody, Archer goes on a course at Catterick. One evening he drops in at the King's Arms in Richmond with a friend. They meet 2 girls. One has dark brown hair and rather peculiar eyes, a long way apart and rather long from corner to corner. Her nose turned up, and she had a rather big mouth, with little teeth like a child's. Her name was Betty. She is married. At first she is evasive about her husband, and evasive towards Archer too. She avoids his kisses, then relents, but when he puts his hand on her breast and tells her he likes her very much, she says, "You wouldn't have done that if you really liked me." Betty tells Archer that she married a childhood friend and got pregnant, only to find that her husband, now in the Middle East, was seeing another woman. Archer tells her that he loves her, but I've no idea for how long, probably not for always. Yet Betty thinks it may quite possibly be for always. Ecstasy describes Archer on leave, travelling from London to York to spend time with Betty. They book in at a hotel, eat, go to the cinema, look around the shops, make love. "I warn you, darling, I'm not very good at this," says Archer. "I'm not either, so it won't notice," Betty replies. But the love-making goes all right. For the first time I was lost in another person, and none of me could stand aside, Archer tells himself. Betty tells him that she is going back to her husband for the sake of her daughter, and Archer admits that he has been unfaithful to her, thinking that she no longer wants to see him. Ecstasy ends with their future in the air. Through the window of Betty's railway carriage, Archer says, "I'm seeing you again," and Betty answers, "Mind you do." Then Archer watches her train steam off to Darlington. In Ecstasy, Betty asks Archer what his father thinks about her, and Archer says he's a bit suspicious. "I think he thinks you're a designing woman." In real life, William Amos's reaction when he discovered his son was having an affair with Elizabeth Simpson was more than suspicious. It was explosive, his outburst of anger no doubt aggravated by the way he found out the truth, which was, through a series of implausibilities and coincidences, unacceptable in any kind of fiction or drama, as Amos wrote in his memoirs. What happened would certainly be denounced by the critics as ludicrous if it turned up in a soap opera. In 1943, Kingsley spent the first part of a leave with Elizabeth, and the second part at home in Berkhamsted. One evening his father ran out of cigarettes, and went rummaging for supplies in Kingsley's overcoat pocket. There he found what he was looking for, a packet of Players. Or so he thought. But when he opened the packet he discovered not cigarettes, but French letters. Kingsley had left himself with a surplus, having overestimated his needs. He thought his leftovers were well enough hidden in the cigarette packet, but he was wrong. His carelessness over details like this was to trip him up repeatedly throughout his married life. William immediately realized that his son was fucking a girl. The truth of who she was soon emerged, and a blazing row followed. William was genuinely shocked to discover that Kingsley was having an affair with a married woman, but the old methods of dispensing retribution no longer carried weight, as they did when punishment could be achieved by switching off the wireless. Kingsley could not be sent away because his mother wanted him at home. William could not stop his pocket money, since it was the army that paid him now. So he did the only thing he could think of. He wrote Kingsley a 500-word letter, carefully thought through and written out. Its tone was such that Kingsley was heartily glad he did not keep it, though he remembered its message. This was part reproach to him for having let his father down, and part self-reproach that father had not trained son in morals sufficiently to resist temptation. "I'd asked you to give her up," Dad said, "if I thought you'd take the slightest notice." Kingsley was daunted by this, but immediately felt better when his father went on to make a snobbish insinuation about Elizabeth being the sort of girl who was no better than she should be. However justified William might have been in berating his son for adultery, Kingsley thought he had no right to berate the adulteress for being who she was. The affair with Elizabeth lasted 2 years, and as Amos remembers it now, it took place mostly in the mind, since there was not enough money for it to take place in hotel bedrooms. "All we knew was cold and never private," he wrote in his poem, Letter to Elizabeth. "Where none would pause, we found an hour to wait, and clung together when the streets were wet." The circumstances of the affair may have been uncomfortable, but it was as fulfilling an experience as Amos had yet had. "At last, love has taught me to speak straight, to make my body walk without a strut." His connection with Elizabeth brought a new deterioration in his relations with his father, but it also inspired the first of his poems he thought good enough to collect. If the invasion of Europe had gone strictly to plan, Amos would have arrived on D-Day plus 14, or 20th of June 1944. As things worked out, he got there on the 30th, driving undramatically up onto the Normandy beach in a jeep, through an inch or two of water from a landing craft manned by indifferent Americans to whom crossing the Channel was already a routine. It was not only Amos's first approach to a battlefield, it was his first trip abroad as well. The purpose of this unit was to provide comprehensive communications for the British Second Army headquarters under Lieutenant General Dempsey, communications upwards to the 21st Army Group commanded by General, later Field Marshal Montgomery, downward to Second Army's own corps and divisions, and sideways to other formations, especially 83 Group of the RAF. Second Army HQ was divided into 3 parts, tactical, main, and rear headquarters, and the signals unit was likewise divided to service each of those HQs. A handful of signalsmen had landed on D-Day itself as part of the small and mobile tactical headquarters, from which General Dempsey conducted his operations. Amos's arrival more than 3 weeks later, when Second Army's frontline troops were already shaping up for the battle for Caen, may be taken as some indication of the lowish priority of his role in the fight against Hitler. On his unit's manpower returns, Amos was first described as 2 Khoi HQ Sub, and from November 1944 as OC91 Tele-Op Sec. He was also promoted to lieutenant. Most of his time was spent as a signal master running an office on 8-hour shifts, first at main headquarters, later at rear. Through the office came messages of all kinds which had to be dispatched and received by wireless, line or dispatch rider, according to the degree of urgency assigned to each one and the means of sending it available at the time. It was Amos's job to make sure that his shift of signalman clerks managed all the traffic with maximum efficiency. This was rather like being in charge of a medium-sized but very busy post office, with the significant difference that nearly all the customers were officers of superior rank to Amos, as a consequence of which he was bollocked all the time. Amos never came under direct fire, but he got close enough to the action to feel scared on occasion. Once an anti-aircraft shell fired from an Allied gun fell quite close by and went off, causing a spatter of fragments to fall on Amos's tent. During the battle for Caen, a Mosquito broke apart, its 2 halves falling on either side of the caravan containing the chief signals officer, Brigadier Stuart, giving rise to a mild sense of grievance among Amos and his chums, who thought it might have done better to make a direct hit on the brigadier. In Normandy, there was heavy air activity at night, though it created more noise than danger. Since it was thought bad form to seek cover in a slit trench, Amos lay in his one-man tent, sleeplessly wondering whether he should use his tin hat to protect his head or his balls from stray pieces of shrapnel, and inconclusively transferring his helmet from one to the other until he fell asleep. Mentioning this in the mess one morning, he was gratified to find that his fellow officers were all filled with similar doubts, though a majority seemed to favor protecting the head. If Amos was never shot at, he saw something of the consequences of those less lucky. He was on the move soon enough after the battle for Falaise in mid-August to come across plenty of the dead, so recently made corpses there had been no time to bulldoze them from the road. He thought, as did most people, that they looked like life-sized dolls. Animal corpses were strewn about too, for Normandy was farming country, and the German army, in spite of its formidable technology, still depended heavily on horse transport. As Amis wrote in his memoirs, the dead horses seemed almost more pitiful than the dead men, rigid in the shafts, with their upper lips drawn above their teeth as if in continuing pain. The dead cows smelt worst. The breakout from the beachheads, of which the Falaise battle was a part, set Second Army headquarters into rapid motion behind its front-line troops. Main headquarters advanced leapfrog fashion, sending on an advance party, then letting the rear party catch up and take over, while rear headquarters tagged along 10 miles or so behind. In September, the pace of advance was such that headquarters units stayed in the same place for as little as 2 days. It was all packing, moving, finding the new location, setting up communications, then doing it all over again, much of it in the dark. By November, the pace had slackened, and rear headquarters settled in for 5 months at Senlis in Belgium. Ennui had time to set in too, and Amis had the leisure to observe his fellow soldiers and even do some writing. When off duty from his signals office, Amis entertained himself as best he could. He smoked, heavily, since the army saw to it that cigarettes cost almost nothing, so entrenching a habit it took him until the 1980s to give up. He got drunk when opportunity allowed, the first such being at a Normandy farm, where in a sitting room looking out on an orchard, a white-haired farmer introduced him to Calvados. Another drinking bout with a grimmer feel to it he described in a letter to his co-writer Frank Coles. It happened in Belgium at Christmas 1944. As a way of getting hold of Amis's jeep, 3 sergeants asked him to a Christmas Eve party. The promised girls did not appear at the party or at a cafe they went on to, so they drove back to camp, where they shared 2 bottles of whiskey and slumped into bed. After less than 4 hours' sleep, Amis was roused at 7 so that he could be part of the army's traditional Christmas ritual in which the officers served tea to the men. When that was done, he drank himself drunk again, painfully, slowly, and sickly. He served the men's Christmas dinner, and then was on guard duty until 2 in the morning, after which he went to bed, desolate and depressed and almost in tears. Later, when the war in Europe was over and he was waiting to be demobbed, he studied works of mild pornography accumulated by the batmen of a holding unit. One item in their library, he remembers, was Lady Chatterley's lover. Amis read 50 or so pages before deciding that that was enough of that. Nor did he feel the need or desire to read more when he put his name to the campaign to have the ban on Lawrence's novel lifted 15 years later. Amis never found much pleasure or consolation in pornography, even if it came bearing literary credentials. He much preferred real women, and in Belgium, Holland, and Germany he searched them out whenever he could, unsuccessfully for the most part, though during a weekend leave in Brussels he contracted scabies from one of 2 females. One was a tart, the other a waitress, but he never knew which one infected him, or whether, if it was the tart, he might regrettably have passed her infection on to the waitress. Drinking and chasing women are things Amis would have been doing if he'd stayed at Oxford. The army offered other subjects of study. There can be few better places for an English novelist to get himself a grounding in questions of authority and class, all the more so in a war which had inflated the services with men from every imaginable non-military background. Second Army's Chief Signals Officer, Brigadier Stuart, was a professional, an officer since 1916, but there were no regular soldiers among the officers in Amis's own unit apart from a couple of pre-war NCOs promoted from the ranks. Nor was technical skill necessarily a key to advancement, even though signals was preeminently a technical service. Keeping line and wireless communications going was the whole point of the unit's existence, but that side of things was left to be got on with by engineers and technicians headed by a major from the post office. Actual command of the unit, in the sense of keeping it fed, supplied, billeted, and disciplined, was in the hands of men who were experienced neither as soldiers nor as communications experts. The seniority required for these positions was largely a matter of long service, which could only have been achieved by a civilian through pre-war membership of the Territorial Army. Amis's CO, Lieutenant Colonel G.F.H. Walker, had reached his position by this route, as had the adjutant, Captain W.F. York. Men like these were less certain in the exercise of their authority than professional officers, to whom it was part of the job, but they relished exercising it nonetheless, no doubt because they had enjoyed nothing like it in civilian life. and they were not reluctant to exercise their power in arbitrary fashion if only to show they possessed it. So far as Amos was concerned, officers like these tended to suffer two further drawbacks. They seemed to share a low level of general culture. In other words, they were not interested in books and other things that interested him. And they were not only suburban and conservative, but conservative, with a capital C, hostile to Amos's brand of politics, and wary of the rising tide of support for Labour among the troops, which was to see Winston Churchill expelled from power at the 1945 general election. For all these reasons, Amos very much disliked his colonel and his adjutant, while they evidently disapproved of him. In this atmosphere, Amos had to go carefully or risk retribution. Punishment need not be tailored to fit the crime, might indeed be doled out without any crime known to King's regulations having been committed. The offence of dumb insolence, under which a soldier could be charged merely for the look on his face, has long been abolished, but it lingered on in spirit, since a punishment could usually be devised for someone judged to deserve one by his superior. The offence of dumb insolence, under which a soldier could be charged merely for the look on his face, has long been abolished, but it lingered on in spirit, since a punishment could usually be devised for someone judged to deserve one by his superior. Amos had the uneasy sense that all he had to do to earn, say, an unwelcome snap inspection of his section transport, or find himself called upon to supply the duty jeep a week ahead of his turn on the roster, was to speak up in the officers' mess for Joe Stalin, or declare that the Warsaw Concerto was a piece of worthless commercialism. No link between indiscretion and subsequent misfortune could be demonstrated, but could one following the other be simply a coincidence? He might be getting paranoid, Amos thought, but the atmosphere of that mess was certainly not one to discourage paranoia. The higher the rank, of course, the more absolute the authority. Amos rarely tangled with the very top brass. General Dempsey, the Second Army commander, he knew about from a distance, mainly from his habit of first telling Signalman Reynolds or one of Reynolds' colleagues what he was going to say at daily conferences, sometimes taken as a sign of the general's easy touch with the lower ranks, though more probably a way of getting things clear in his own mind. Amos once tangled with Brigadier Stuart. Visiting Amos in his signal master's office, he spotted a cigarette burning in an ashtray. When Amos admitted it was his, the brigadier said, "Put it out. It's a disgusting habit." That Amos should have remembered this not very exciting incident for 50 years says something about the powerful impression senior officers could make on him. But among officers with red tabs on their lapels, Colonel the Lord Glenarthur was Amos's particular hate. The biggest shit on the entire staff, as he described him in his memoirs. As Brigadier the Lord Fawcett, Lord Glenarthur turns up in Amos's story My Enemy's Enemy, here more moderately described as the largest and sharpest thorn in the side of the entire signals unit. Both real and fictitious lords present the same problem to their respective signal masters. They both want a special dispatch rider to make a trip of 100 miles or more across Belgium to Brussels to pick things up, and they want him at once. SDRs were supposed to be reserved for items of military importance too urgent to wait for the regular dispatch rider service. Tom Thurston, the signal master in the story, suspects that the real purpose of the trip was to take in the brigadier's soiled laundry and bring back the clean stuff, plus any wines, spirits and cigars that the brigadier's Brussels agent might have got together for him. But what can Thurston do to stop it? He has already raised the brigadier's behavior with the adjutant, only to be informed at length that the job of signals was to give service to the staff. Rank, rather than military necessity, was what counted, so Lord Fawcett gets his SDR from Thurston, as did Lord Glenarthur from a reluctant Amos. The wartime army offered a bewildering variety of opportunities to be punished. At one extreme you might be shot for refusing to obey an order. At the other you might suffer tiresome extra duties of the kind Amos believed he was landed with for being thought tiresome himself. The territory between was a minefield, littered with a legion of other punishments. Amos was hauled up before a court of inquiry in an incident which he later described in another short story, Court of Inquiry. Amos, reappearing here under his who-else's rank name of Frank Archer, arrived at a new location to discover that a charging engine was missing from his stores, and sent a sergeant back to where he thought it must have been left. The sergeant returned hours later without it. The engine was no great loss. It did not work and never had. Besides, it was obsolete, and there were no spare parts available. On top of which the quartermaster had another one in his store, an engine in full working order, which he could perfectly well have issued as a replacement if one was needed. All this, while relevant to the efficient working of the unit as a means of transmitting signals, was irrelevant to its efficient operation as a system of discipline. Never mind whether the engine's disappearance mattered a hoot to the conduct of the war. The point was that the engine was on charge to Archer, as to Amos. Archer, like Amos, had lost it, so Archer, like Amos, could be charged with negligence. In both real life and fiction, a court of inquiry was formally convened, although there seems to have been no proper legal ground for holding one. Nothing more substantial on which to base a charge, in fact, than Major Raleigh's feeling, in court of inquiry, that he's had just about enough of young Archer. A friendly member of the three-man court, Captain Jock Watson, tells Archer it's a complete farce, just a bit of saber-rattling. But Archer decides to play safe. He admits inefficiency, negligence, even personal humiliation. "What makes me so ashamed is that I've let the company down," he grovels. And he adds to Major Raleigh, "That's what gets me. Failing in my duty by you, sir, when you've always been so decent to me about everything, and backed me up, and encouraged me." All this, of course, is the exact opposite of what Archer actually thinks about the Major, but so thoroughly has he abased himself that the court can hardly do more than award him the lightest rap on the knuckles in the form of a reprimand, the same painless punishment as was handed down to Amos. Afterwards, Jock Watson cannot quite decide whether Archer was play-acting, as he says he was, or grovelling from the heart. Either way, the process seems to have made Archer older and wiser. It was true, Watson reflects, that the army would lick anyone into shape. You could even say that it made a man of you. But what kind of man? A groveller? A shameless lick-spittle, willing to go along with almost anything his superiors tell him? Well, yes, more or less. That seemed to be the sort of young officer the army wanted, at any rate Amos's part of the army. It was tempting to play the game, go along with the whims of senior officers for the sake of an easy life. Amos explored these themes further in My Enemy's Enemy. In this story, the colonel and the adjutant take a dislike to a technical officer called D'Alessio, a surname borrowed from a soldier in Amos's unit, who is good at his job, but Italian in origin, which is bad enough, and offhand, if not contemptuous about the disciplinary side of army life, which is even worse. The two propose to catch D'Alessio out with a barrack-room inspection, which they take it for granted he will fail, unless, that is, someone tips him off that it is about to happen. Thurston, a signal master, is in a position to do so, but since he is known to be sympathetic to D'Alessio, he is warned off by the adjutant, with the threat that the home leave he is soon due could be cancelled. Thurston keeps quiet, but D'Alessio is tipped off all the same by another officer, Bentham, a regular soldier from before the war, promoted to captain from the ranks. Later, Bentham confronts Thurston. As a regular soldier, Bentham has standards, even if the others do not. He thinks the army too important for this kind of plotting and scheming, and he doesn't like to see an able man taken down by a bunch of ignorant, jumped-up so-called bloody gentlemen from the territorial army. His main contempt, however, is reserved for Thurston. Wasn't he supposed to be the great one for pouring scorn on the unit's senior officers? Yes, says Bentham. You could talk about them till you were black in the face, but when it came to doing something, talking where it would do some good, you kept your mouth shut. And he finishes, I think you're a bastard. So Thurston is a crawling collaborator with the very people he claims to despise. The version of Amos drawn by Frank Coles in a chapter called Francis in Sackcloth, in their collaborative novel Who Else Is Rank, suggests why it was that Amos Archer was so prone to fall foul of his military superiors. He was easily discountenanced, which argued inefficiency. He too readily told the truth and was therefore considered irresponsible. He was honest in his opinions, and this made him conceited. He unguardedly made intelligent contributions to the desultory discussions in the mess and was accused of posing. He was polite and considerate to his inferiors, and was therefore unable to exercise command. Amos Archer was too young. He looked little more than a boy in uniform. He was used to intelligent companions, and he was slow to adjust himself to the change, and he never learned that the unforgivable thing was to lose face. The trouble with Amos Archer was that he didn't fit into any of the slots thought suitable for young officers. He wasn't what was expected of an Oxford man, which apparently included being uninterested in both sex and politics. He wasn't a gentleman, and he did not acknowledge the superior merits of those who were, or pretended to be, though the nearest thing to a real gentleman the regiment could boast, Coles thought, would have chilled a cavalry mess with horror. Amos Archer was not superlatively efficient, and he did not display the unbounded energy which would have made him acceptable, because then the others could have loaded all the work onto him. Poor Amos Archer. He wasn't even subservient or unobtrusive. Nor would he ever realize that an opinion, however erroneous, if it emanated from a major, must be treated with respect, and if it emanated from a colonel, it had the force of law. Even after 2 years in the army, he thought that erroneous opinions were dangerous and should be combated, which wouldn't have been so bad if he'd used tact, but his superior knowledge was always deployed recklessly, and the advantage quickly lost. As Frank Coles describes it, he could generally protect Amos Archer from being savaged in the mess. Outside, it was different. If Amos Archer ever put a foot wrong, he was for it. Immediately it became a dereliction of duty, a matter for strong censure. His character and efficiency were called into question. When this happened, he was always discountenanced and came away thoroughly miserable, humiliated. Amos Archer seems to have been no worse than the other officers, no less efficient or hard-working, just more exposed and vulnerable. Further reasons why this might be so are given in a description of Amos Archer's general demeanor. He played no games. He took less exercise than anyone in the company, though when he could not avoid it, he showed agility enough. He philandered in public. He talked freely of his homosexual friends in Oxford. He spoke of intercourse between the sexes, much as the rest spoke of football, eating, or drinking. He wrote poetry in the signal office and used a typewriter for it. He mooched along like a student, and when he saluted he compelled you to observe how badly he did it. Though he studied his appearance, the result was never what it should have been. He did have to his credit undoubted qualities. Above all, he was fun to be with. There was no meal that was not duller if Amos Archer was on duty, no incident that was not livelier if he had witnessed it too, no topic, except shop, that you could discuss unless he was present. Amos's mimicry and wit were saving graces, but not enough to save him from the bullying of his fellow officers. When the war in Europe was finally won in May 1945, the mood within the forces changed. Whatever junior officers might have thought of their seniors or professional soldiers thought of amateur, the overwhelming common interest in winning the fight had kept differences in check. But now the guns were silent, conscripted men were eager to go home and resume their old lives, few more so than Amos. Without a common enemy, cohesion among the ranks was less easy to achieve, discipline harder to enforce. Having defeated the Germans, soldiers were required not to fraternize with them. There was no one left for the British Army to quarrel with but itself. Men ceased to be units in a military machine and became individuals again. Differences of interest, class, and politics were free to emerge and divide. The senior officers found they had not many credible sanctions left to brandish at their restless subordinates, except a posting to the Far East, where the war against Japan had still to be won. Women soldiers appeared among the men. It had not been thought proper, so to speak, to bring them into the theatre of war, but now they were fetched from Britain to replace male soldiers due for demob or dispatch to the East. Few places were seen as more suitable for their deployment than a signals office like Amos's, which remained in business providing communications for Second Army's dwindling administrative needs, though less hectically busy than it had been before. Amos fell foul of 2 of these ATS soldiers in an incident that gave him a lesson in sexual politics to match anything he had learned about men's machinations in the officers' mess, and taught him something more about women than he could hope to pick up in a Brussels brothel. One soldier in the signal office was Private Joe Armitage, a name Amos invented for her later. Her job was to see that messages were directed by the best and quickest route, whether via teleprinter or dispatch rider. Instructions for doing this were clear and simple, and there seemed little scope for error. All the same, she managed to send one message by the wrong route, some query about surplus 3-tonner canopies via a disbanded mobile bath unit in Holland, as Amos caricatured it. He summoned her to his office, an area floor marked off by crates of obsolete line transmission equipment, told her how she should have handled it, and asked her to make sure she did it that way next time. She said that she would. Amos thought no more about it, being quite certain his reprimand was well-deserved and delivered with no more than due severity, if only because, by this stage, no message seemed so urgent or important that he need get worked up about its going astray. A new colonel had lectured Amos and his other officers sternly on the need for all ranks to treat the newly arrived women with perfect correctness, which Amos thought he had done by treating her as he would a male soldier. That night in the mess, however, he was reproached by Private Armitage's woman officer, who said he had given her such a brutal ticking off that she completely broke down. At first Amos insisted he had done nothing of the sort, but then modified his defence to placate the officer, admitting untruthfully that he might have spoken a little more sharply than was strictly necessary. The officer was mollified, though tried to get Amos to apologize, which he evaded doing by pleading that the colonel would forbid any officer to humble himself to a private. Private Armitage and her officer were not the last women in Amos's life or fiction who seemed to him willing to get their way by any means, however unfair, including deployment of the fact of their sexual difference as sufficient reason for special treatment. Amos's signals section was run down, then finally disbanded. He was sent to a reinforcement holding unit, RHU, at Minden in Westphalia, where he found more time to study the Batman's pornography collection than inclination to sightsee in the town. Around August he was sent to another RHU in Bruges. Here too he avoided sightseeing, though the attractions of Bruges' bridges and churches were greater than anything in Minden. He tried to write a story and to chase a nurse, unsuccessfully in both cases, though he made a better job of finding drinking companions among old Second Army comrades who had turned up at the same unit. Amos catches the confused and tetchy atmosphere of these early days of peace in the third of his stories based on Army life, I Spy Strangers. Frank Archer is now with the rump of a signals company, the main part of his old unit having been sent to handle communications at the Potsdam Conference. The company is commanded by Major Raleigh, a temporary officer who, in his reluctance to return to civilian life, still harbors hopes of glory, ranging from the instant suppression of a Nazi uprising, crushed by him in a single prompt and ruthless blow, to the more modest ambition of being made area commandant, with a promotion to lieutenant colonel. He tries to keep his company up to military scratch while he awaits one or another of these improbable triumphs, but he senses anarchy mounting, discipline and seriousness and purpose melting away. The Major connects this with politics and the impending general election. He knows of hardly anybody who intends to vote Labour, and yet he feels unwelcome change in the air. The story focuses round sessions of a mock parliament he has authorized, in which a few enthusiasts of left and right argue their case around and above the heads of the minority who bother to attend. On the left stands Archer, who plays the part of Speaker, and Signalman Hargreaves, the Foreign Secretary. On the right, indeed the far right, stands Sergeant Dole, a smoothly efficient unit clerk and former complaints supervisor at a Leeds department store who is opposition spokesman on defense. Hargreaves supports all things Russian while Dole attacks them, even going so far as to propose that the Nazis be enlisted in the all-important cause of resistance to communism. This is too much for Hargreaves. He storms out of the Parliament, which heavily increases Raleigh's dislike for him, and also gives Raleigh an extra reason to feel hostile towards Archer, because he is Hargreaves' superior officer. In another session of the Parliament, Raleigh is moved to counter the leftish tone of the proceedings by speaking himself. As he waffles on about how the classes in Britain have always got on pretty well together, Hargreaves interjects with I Spy Strangers, the formula by which MPs at Westminster can clear the Commons of visitors. Raleigh, as a senior officer, is in the Parliament as a visitor, not as a member. Speaker Archer rules that he must leave. This piece of impertinence is absolutely the last straw for Raleigh, who now uses his friendly contact at headquarters to get both Hargreaves and Archer posted east. But his plans are subverted. Sergeant Dole contrives to ease Hargreaves' lot by getting his friend Hammond put on the same transfer list, while Archer is saved from going east altogether by being granted an early release to return to Oxford to finish his degree course. The signals company is broken up. Raleigh's hopes for promotion and a new command are dashed, and, as if all that were not enough, Labour wins the general election. The Major's world, for the time being at least, is in pieces. The story was written years after the war and dramatizes the mood of the time rather than describes events that took place. There was, for instance, no mock parliament in any of Amos's units. Another fictional version of the same period, written at the time, has the feeling of a closer version of Amos's political views and his tactless way of presenting them to his fellow officers. It is in the section of Who Else Is Rank called Parting. Frank Archer is among a group of officers still hanging about in the mess bar at 2 a.m. The colonel harangues them about what a good job their unit has done, then invites Archer to say a few words calling for silence and introducing him as if he were an MP, the Member for Enger. Archer endorses the colonel's praise, and then goes on to say that it's not the officers or even the senior NCOs that have made the unit a success, but the lance corporals, the signalmen, and the drivers. So far so good. The colonel agrees. But then Archer extrapolates a lesson for civilian life from his praise of the rank and file. It is the common men of the unit who have done the real work, so we must see to it after we're demobilized that these common men, from whom we're separated only by a traditional barrier, we're no more than common men ourselves, benefit from the work that has been done. And if the system won't let that happen, well, we shall just have to change the system. This is going much too far. Archer is told he is talking a load of balls, and that he shouldn't bring politics into the mess. The colonel puts the opposite view. He summed up for the government. He didn't want any talk about changing systems. The present system had produced the teamwork that had won the war. It's tradition, do you see, that makes a nation great. What he wants to see is the spirit that has made his unit go with a swing carried on. The comradeship, the mutual confidence, the old helping hand. He promises to do what he can to help anyone from the unit who gets into difficulties when they are all civilians again. Archer thinks this is an obscene suggestion, and makes his exit, proclaiming that politics come in everywhere. Even in an officer's mess, where by tradition politics, along with sex and religion, are not discussed, for fear of stirring up arguments and divisions in what is supposed to be a single-minded and coherent body of men. This little incident carries much of the flavour of 1945. On the right stood those like the colonel who thought that Britain, being on the winning side in the war, was self-evident proof that the country was in excellent shape, needing only a bit of goodwill to keep the system well-oiled and running. On the left were those like Amos and Archer who thought exactly the opposite, that the war had shown up all the unfairness and inefficiency of the old system, which would have to be thoroughly shaken up if there was to be justice for the real heroes, the ordinary unsung privates and junior NCOs. Although Amos might be at odds with the likes of his colonel, however, the army had diluted his left-wing convictions. He was no longer a communist. The declarations and slogans of that faith now seemed to him abstract and empty, ideas in the head rather than recipes for getting things done. Having seen something of the huge range of detailed and expert work that had gone into the invasion of Europe, Amos no longer believed that great undertakings could be left to men with ideas alone. For all its inefficiencies and absurdities, its jumped-up officers and put-upon men, the army had got the job done. Would more benevolent-seeming organizations like, say, the Fabian Society or the General Post Office have done it better? Of course not. The very idea was ridiculous. The army had taught Amos something else about political reality. Communism and socialism were, after all, about more than ideas. They were about ideals, too, requiring some degree of self-sacrifice and altruism for their fulfillment. Amos had seen little of that in the army. From privates in the barrack room to Colonel the Lord Glenarthur, what he had seen was the relentless play of self-interest and personal gratification, with people jostling for whatever advantages they could squeeze out of the system. The post-war Amos was more skeptical, less starry-eyed about politics. He made sure that his father delivered his proxy vote of Labour at the 1945 election, but by now he was hopeful of small mercies from politics rather than large. In I Spy Strangers, Archer looks forward to an England full of girls and drinks and jazz and books and decent houses and decent jobs and being your own boss. That also sounds very like the England Amos wanted by the end of the war. Not put through a root and branch revolution, communist style, but improved and made jolly comfortable and nice for everybody by Labour. Even in his imagination, however, Amos did not quite go so far as to believe that a Labour government would secure him a constant supply of girls. Loss of political illusions was not all Amos took away from the army. As he put it in his poem A Reunion, he and his fellow conscripts were not so much young as new. He and they were in a ripe state to be marked by whatever happened to them, and the army in wartime was an excellent place in which to accumulate experience, one sort often seeming to contradict another. If selfishness was a conspicuous motive among the characters in Amos's army experience, and the stories he based on them, alongside or beneath it lay something like its opposite. A basic decency, a sense of solidarity, often more likely to be found among the lower ranks than the officers. He paid tribute to this in the same poem. So when one of us had his leave stopped, was awarded a dose of the clap, or an extra guard, or was dropped up to his ears in the crap, or felt plain bloody browned off, he never got left on his own. The others had muscle enough to see that he soldiered on. The imaginary comrades Amos saw in the stories of military heroics he had read as a boy did in the real army become something like the shadow brothers he had also seen in those stories. As a means of acquiring companions, of populating his days with the chums that his home life had so conspicuously lacked, the army was far from being a total disappointment. Amos did not, however, make many friendships that lasted beyond his demob. The army also left Amos with a catalogue of fears, which he described in another poem, Release, published in his first collection, Bright November, in 1947. These included fear of the telephone, of entering a crowded room by myself, of loud voices calling me to interview, of typewritten notes, of arriving late at night. But, he added, I have survived them too, and they have caused nothing that will ever want to remember them. The army had done its bit to lengthen the list of anxieties from which Amos has suffered all his life, but if the army had not supplied them, some other source very probably would. The army's system of rank and authority, reasonable enough in theory but arbitrary and unfair in practice, also left its mark on Amos. The sense of power having fallen into the wrong hands, of the wrong people being in charge, became a regular theme of Amos's, beginning with the first page of his first novel, Lucky Jim. No other professor in Great Britain set such store by being called Professor. The young lecturer Jim Dixon thinks of his boss and tormentor Professor Welch. In fact, just like the Major in Who Else's Rank, whom all junior officers made sure to call Sir, because there was no other field officer in the British Army who attached so much importance to not having the Sir left out. How, Dixon wonders, had Welch become a professor of history at all? By published work? No. By extra good teaching? No, in italics. Then how? As usual, Dixon shelved this question, telling himself that what mattered was that this man had decisive power over his future. Again, this was just like Amos's superior officers in the army, whose promotion was as much of an uncrackable mystery as Welch's, but whose power over Amos was every bit as decisive. Jim struggled to keep a job he doesn't much want against the capricious, second-rate but godlike authority of Welch has something in it of Amos's struggle to keep on at least tolerable terms with his equally capricious, second-rate but godlike officers in an army he very much didn't want to belong to. At Thirsk, Amos handed in his revolver, picked up his demob clothes and headed gratefully back to Oxford, causing a lot of satisfying resentment among Class A men, who, though many were older and with longer service, were not judged ready for release, having no interrupted university degree course to which to return. Amos was 23 years old and part of Group 19, while some of the others were 25 years of age and belonged to Group 46, which in theory gave them a higher priority for discharge. But such were the arbitrary ways of the military, and for once the toss of the coin came down with Amos's side up. Glad though he was to be back in civilian clothes, Amos did not forget, nor much resent, his wartime stint. The army continued to fascinate him, and he was to return to draw on his experience of it much later, not only in his short stories, but later still in his novels, The Anti-Death League, 1966, and Russian Hide-and-Seek, 1980, and in characters like the two old sweats, Company Sergeant Major Furs, in The Egyptologists, 1965, and Shorty Shortle, in Ending Up, 1974. His attitudes towards the army were mixed and ambiguous. Like most ex-conscripts, a combination of affection, wonder, grievance, respect, overlaid by a powerful desire never to repeat the experience. He continued to admire the military virtues, even though he could hardly claim many of them for himself, and his schoolboy's admiration for romantic heroism survived, though in modified form. I know military glory is all nonsense, he said in 1968. It consists of knocking off a lot of other human beings. But it is glorious not to run away, and fortitude is a virtue, and so is not letting one's side down. It seems only proper to have Amos exit from this unsettling deviation from the natural path of his life to the march of the Royal Corps of Signals, or rather to the words invented for it by some anonymous signalman, which Amos still remembers 50 years later. They sum up much of the typical British soldier's feelings about his lot. pride in a job well done, mixed with resentment at being buggered about by rule-bound higher-ups who don't understand or care, this all-too-familiar contradiction being resolved in a resigned and weary humour. Begone, dull care, the links are all working today. The lines are through and the S plus TX is okay. But the branch they don't tell us we're bloody fine fellows, they send in a stinker to say, your strength returns have not been sent here today. The S plus TX was a state-of-the-art Second World War device for transmitting speech and teleprinter messages along the same line. 6. Peacetime Oxford. The Oxford to which Amos returned from the army in October 1945 was still drab and rationed, but Amos did his best to enliven things by following his personal post-war program of not working, getting drunk, and pursuing young women. A setback to these plans soon emerged when Amos discovered that his father had failed to pay his outstanding college bills of close to £100, settling which cost most of the gratuity the army had paid him off with. This roused some resentment, though Amos never did challenge his father over the missing cash. Amos went back to live in St. John's, in a new set of rooms he found handsome, but located in the college's new quad, which he found dismal. Although rationing and shortages were still the rule for everything from clothes to food, the most intrusive restrictions of Amos's first stint at the university, blackout, fire watching, military training, had disappeared. So too had many of his friends, who were either still in the forces or had been spared military service on health grounds and had therefore been free to graduate and move on. Philip Larkin was by now a librarian, as he was to remain for the rest of his life, already holding his first job in Wellington, Shropshire. Distance did not mean that the friendship between Amos and Larkin diminished, rather it intensified. When they were both at Oxford, they had tended to meet casually, two friends among groups of undergraduate chums. Now, when they met, it was by careful arrangement, alone or with their girlfriends at Oxford or Berkhamsted, in Wellington, or from 1946, in Leicester, where Larkin moved to the university library. They got into the habit of writing regularly, once a week or so. These letters were small entertainments, written for each other's amusement as much as to pass on information, often breaking into a private language in which words would be reconstructed by their sounds, as in Saf, Fic, Li, A, Zong, for Sapphic liaison, or Car, Nal, Con, Q, Pis, Ents, for carnal concupiscence. Amos's words would be misspelt, as though he had bungled his two-fingered typing. Seriously, though, Seruously, Htuohg, or nonsensical, and Bumball and Gumball and Pokemoke and Knockbum and Pockbum and Shaggy Aggy Schweppes, or in the form of pastiche. Thank you most kindly for your letter, which arrived yesternight, and ye moft dierting book of Mr. Ionas Bettyman, which did come this morning. Larkin replied in similar style. Their letters were full of plans to meet, and assessments of the latest jazz records to come their way. Sex, too, featured strongly. They reported recent developments with the girls in their lives, and continued the lesbian stories they had started when they were at Oxford together. A wisp of yellow hair fell across her brow, and one of the straps of her slip dropped from her shoulder, revealing... But what Marcia revealed, Amos left Larkin to guess in his letter of the 5th of February 1946. Sometimes their letters were even serious. Their friendship deepened, and each became and remained the other's most important male friend for the rest of their lives. Although Larkin was to be as famous a poet as Amos a novelist, literature was not the main basis of their friendship. If that had been all they had in common, they might hardly have been friends at all, since Amos disliked most literary talk, and in any case disagreed with Larkin on many literary matters. What there was between them instead, Amos tried to sum up in two letters in June 1946. In the first, written soon after they had spent a week together, Amos said, I enjoy talking to you more than to anybody else, because I never feel I am giving myself away, and so can admit to shady, dishonest, crawling, cowardly, unjust, arrogant, snobbish, lecherous, perverted, and generally shameful feelings that I don't want anyone else to know about. But most of all, because I'm always on the verge of violent laughter when talking to you, and because you are savagely uninterested in all the things I'm interested in. At intervals during the past few days, phrases like very good-natured little wolf, a taunting guardian, Dog shit, his man. That makes me crap. No beer, sir. Come into my brain and make my mouth open into a large laugh. 5 days later, Amos returned to the theme. I've a feeling that what we have to say to each other is more or less inexhaustible. By which I mean that we don't feel A, as one feels with women so often, that once one has worked through what has happened to each since the last meeting there will be little left to say, nor B, as one feels with other friends, even Christopher Toswell of late, that one has been through everything once, and all one's conversation is a reworking of former themes. Am I right about that? Amos most probably was. Conversation has always been important to him, and someone he could talk to on every level of intimacy, someone who was funny, verbally deft, interested and uninterested in the same things, and inexhaustible too, made the ideal friend for him. But Amos's appetite for company required friends closer at hand, in Oxford, and he set about recruiting some new ones. Among them was John Wayne, who had been spared war service because of his lungs, and was already established as a junior fellow at St. John's and a lecturer at Reading University. Amos felt some reservations about him because he sported a walking stick and had the general air of a don in his 40s, though 3 years younger than Amos himself. But Wayne was a jazz lover, told stories, was worldly wise. The two got on well, and were soon having occasional lunches at the Eagle and Child, otherwise known as the Bird and Baby, the St. John's pub. Amos was to credit Wayne with giving him several shoves along his career path, encouraging him to aim for a first, to teach at a university rather than a school, to be a proper writer rather than a dabbler. Wayne also gave Lucky Jim what was to turn out to be a useful boost on the radio, even before it was published. But they were to drift apart over the years through a series of often trivial incidents, culminating in a story not denied by Wayne, to the effect that he believed Amos's wife would break down his bedroom door to get her hands on him. Another post-war friend was Kenneth Tynan, who came up to Oxford for the first time in the same term that Amos returned, bringing with him the first hints that pre-war glamour might return, or, as Larkin more gloomily put it, that all that was starting up again. Tynan, later famous as theatre critic, polemist, and first dramaturg of the National Theatre, wore velvet suits and damask shirts, was witty and flamboyant, but also generous with his money and his encouragement, buying drinks and trying unsuccessfully to help Amos get his first novel published. They later collaborated on a television program. But his theatrical world was not Amos's. Indeed, what Amos called in his memoirs the general trendy left-wing showbiz, Zen Buddhism, pot-smoking, bullfight cult international America, happening subculture which Tynan promoted at Oxford, and then in London, was very far from the sort of thing Amos ever enjoyed. It was a point of honour among Amos and his circle not to pursue university women, a case, perhaps, of forging a virtue from necessity. Male undergraduates far outnumbered female at the time, and the women who did get into Oxford tended to be hard-working types. Nurses' homes, secretarial colleges, language schools, and other such institutions provided girls the university lacked, and Elliston and Cavill's tea room made a point of contact, where undergraduate men went on the chance of picking up women, and women went on the chance of being picked up. If he spotted a woman he liked the look of over morning coffee, a man might send her a message, and she might agree to go out with him if she, too, liked what she saw. One day, very soon after he returned to Oxford in January 1946, Amos spotted a very young, very pretty blonde across the room. A girl he knew agreed to pass on his interest. She turned out to be Hilary Bardwell. That morning she received 2 other messages, one from a man reading chemistry, and another from one reading something else now forgotten, perhaps politics, philosophy, and economics. Whatever it was, she did not feel she knew enough about it, or about chemistry, to make for an easy outing with either man, whereas she knew something at least about the English Amos was reading. So she agreed to go out with him, though with some reluctance. She did not think he was particularly good-looking, being romantically keen on the darker, more Latin look at the time. Nor was she impressed by the clothes he wore. His wardrobe included what Amos called his policeman's trousers, together with a hairy ginger suit. She assumed he was still going about in his demob clothes, but they were not, though they may have looked like it. Hilary Bardwell was the youngest of a family of 5, 2 girls and 3 boys, her father Leonard being one of 5 children too. He was an unenthusiastic official of the Ministry of Agriculture, whose job involved a lot of paperwork to do with the export of animals. It would have been far more to his taste to be an academic or librarian. The Bardwells were originally from Cheshire, but the vagaries of ministry postings had moved the family around the country. Hilary was brought up in Kingston-upon-Thames, near London, and when her father retired after the war, the family home shifted to Harwell, not far from Oxford, and later known as the centre of Britain's nuclear programme. She was sent to boarding school at Bedales in Hampshire, and was removed from there to Dr. Williams' School for Young Ladies in North Wales, so as to be safe from wartime bombing. Hilary was expelled from this school for running away, and returned to Bedales, which she left again soon afterwards at the age of 15, and under something of a cloud, having run away from that too. Animals were her great love, then and all her life, and she found a job as a trainee kennel maid in a set of kennels run by 2 lesbians at Bracknell. Art and biology were the only things at which Hilary felt herself to be any good by the end of her abbreviated education. So when the war finished, she signed on as an art student at Ruskin College in Oxford. But she did not pursue her studies for long, abandoning her course and becoming a model at the college instead. When Amos met her, he was told that she was Ruskin's head model, a title that carried some resonance. Surely the head model must be the best, therefore the most beautiful. Perhaps she was, but her title was a job description rather than a badge of rank, meaning that she modelled only her head. She was far too shy to strip off her clothes for the benefit of any student life class. Hilary got by on her earnings from that, and the £3 a week her father allowed each of his children. Amos soon learned that Hilary was not the 22-year-old he'd thought she was, but 17, and hence, as he wrote to Larkin, not nearly so depraved as I'd hoped. He also discovered that she liked jazz and collected records, one of which she soon sold to him. It was Georgia on My Mind, sung by Hoagy Carmichael, which Amos bought for 7 shillings and sixpence. By early March, Amos was able to report to Larkin, Hilary is coming on nicely. She does really like jazz. Her breasts are concave on top, and she likes me. Not that everything went smoothly between them. A week later, Amos told Larkin that at a party, Hilary was stupider and more boring than ever. But a week after that, he was staying on in Oxford, beyond the end of term, partly to avoid going home to Berkhamsted, and partly to enjoy himself with her, smoking, drinking, and making, at present, unconsummated love. He discovered that her nickname was Hilly, and Hilly was what he called her forever afterwards. In May, Amos apologized to Larkin for being late with his regular letter, giving preoccupation with Hilly as his excuse. We've been arguing for the past week about sleeping in the same bed as each other. First she said no, and I said she would have to say yes. Then she said yes, and I said I'd forced her into it, and what she meant was no. Then she said no, and I feel hurt and angry and disappointed, and am trying to make her say yes. And there for the moment the matter rests. If only one could be ruthless about these things. On the 22nd of May, however, Amos had better news to report. Hilly has yielded. In July, Amos went to stay with Hilly's family at their home, Abbey Timbers in Harwell. He liked being with her, but not with her family, for reasons he described to Larkin. One brother wore sandals and saffron trousers and no socks, and a green shirt, and plays the recorder, yes, and likes Tudor music. Another brother was a conscientious objector, and the father does folk dancing. Poke dancing? Pock dancing? Fock dancing? These were just the kind of tastes that lucky Jim Dixon was to find so bogusly artistic, and therefore offensive, in Professor Welch and his family. Towards the end of August, Amos went with Hilly and an Oxford friend, Christopher Toswell, to France, staying at the Hôtel du Cheval de Bronze at Remiremont in the Vosges, until the second week of September. The hotel cost each of them 12 shillings and sixpence a day, including meals. Nothing wrong with that. But the beer, Amos complained to Larkin, tastes of sweet cardboard. In Paris he had not found any jazz records worth buying, and in Remiremont there was a shortage of local colour, apart from mountains. Amos did not have enough money to get drunk much, and he failed to bring any books with him. He didn't think he really liked the French, because they expected people to talk to them in their own language, and as he put it to Larkin, I'm in continual fear of being thrown 8 of the hotel, for illis sit sec su al indulgence. The proprietor, Amos thought, looks as if he might be strong on ethical and moral standards. After a week or so of this, Amos began to think that Miss Hilly and myself have been seeing quite enough of each other, and I want to get my life to myself again. As he put it, certiorari has more or less the same effect on a chap as frustration. There is the same wanting to be by oneself, and the same not wanting to take the trouble to be nice, and the same feeling that one has let oneself down, and the same feeling that one has been caught in an unpleasant and ineluctable conspiracy. Amos recognized that this was uncharitable of him, because Hilly was so nice. It would probably all clear up when we see less of each other, only it will have to be a good deal less. The trouble with Hilly was that she didn't talk. Amos thought he had to be the source of everything we share. It would have been different if Larkin had been with them. Then they would have smoked and drunk and talked, and Amos would be laughing a lot of the time and enjoying myself all of the time. There were good things, though, like sleeping and eating and idling a lot. Perhaps he was ill-humoured because he had broken out in itchy spots, brought on by eating too much fruit, and the French cigarettes he had been smoking, corporal ordinaire, that made me feel not well. But before the end of the holiday he and Hilly had made things up, and we partied quite cheerfully. By then it was Toswell he was getting fed up with. In Hilly's phrase, he talked too much like a badly written book.